Ex-cult members of Reddit, how were you introduced to the cult and how did you manage to escape? Well, I was born into a family that were Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, whether they are a cult or not is debatable. But I for one do believe that it is one. The moment where I realized that I had to leave was when I brought my friend over one day. My mom scolded me for bringing them over and told me that everyone was out to ruin my life if they weren't in the same religion as us. They would talk about how they are horrible and corrupt people. That we needed to cleanse them. I took a look at my friend and I couldn't see that. All I saw was love and kindness. I knew that these views would corrupt themselves. And then I started to talk to my brother who also shared the same thoughts. We both brought it up with our parents and the elders of our church. And none of them could give us any answers about anything. This is when we both decided that we cannot follow the lead of people that cannot explain what they are leading us into. In the end, we just didn't really believe in the religion itself. My mother is a follower of Supreme Master Ching Hai since 2004. Google her. Really weird when it first started. Tried to force my dad and the whole family to eat vegan and wasted tons of money on useless merchandise. Like an $800 portrait of the master. Aside from that and the condescension toward us non-believers. No real culty threats like you typically hear. Edit. $. Dollar bill y'all. Not my story. But my parents' story is pretty decent. I've posted this somewhere else before too. My parents grew up in a religious cult and as teenagers. They fell in love, but when they asked permission from the church elders to court each other and get married, they were denied. My mum was excommunicated suddenly in her early 20s. She didn't know why until finding out by chance a long time later, so they didn't see each other again for 20 years while one remained on the inside and the other in the real world. Mum tried writing to him a couple times, but dad was brainwashed and told her that she was evil and should repent for her sins. Things that he had been told about her by the cult, etc. Both remained unmarried. When dad was excommunicated himself 20 years later, my mum heard about it through his brother who had left some years earlier. It took them another year to get in contact. They were in different continents. Didn't know where each other were and dad was trying desperately to get used to life in the outside world. Having never lived in normal society before and now in his mid-40s. Dad told us later that he wanted to find mum, but was afraid because he believed she was going to hell. Edit. Clarified this with dad this morning. Apparently he didn't believe this when he left actually, but he spent at least a year wondering if he should ask to go back because he believed that his soul was damned by leaving. One day he finally had a letter from mum. He wrote back immediately and basically assumed that they were getting married, packed his bags and moved across the world to find her. Mum answered a door to dad in the early 80s. Having not seen him in 20 years. They were engaged that night and married within 6 weeks. They are still happily together. And NBSB. Edit. This got a lot more attention than I expected. Really sorry to those who were frustrated that I didn't address this properly and asked you to fish in the comments. My inbox went a bit nuts and I didn't know how to handle it. Just to answer a few questions that people are asking. Regarding mum's excommunication, she was permitted to study briefly in a college on the outside, and while she was there, she took a clipping from a magazine that had some kind of stitching pattern on it for a baby's clothing and sent it to a friend of hers in the cult, as her friend was expecting. What my mum didn't realize at the time was that on the back of the clipping was an advertisement for birth control. Her friend told the elders that my mum had sent her blasphemous material. They didn't believe in birth control, and she was excommunicated right after that. Regarding that, I spoke to him this morning, and this is the reason he was excommunicated. It's quite an interesting story that I didn't know myself. He wrote a letter whilst he was still there to the elder, expressing his view on the unjust doctrines in the cult that he didn't agree with and felt were wrong. He wrote it and read it through, but then screwed it up and threw it in his bin. While he was away from his room, one of the members found it in his bin. Yay, privacy is not a thing. Someone else's work detail is to clean rooms and can also use this as an opportunity search for contraband, and took it to the elder and he was called for interrogation. He was expelled that night. They gave him $50, one of their old cars and a blanket, and sent him packing. He was in his mid-40s and had never lived in normal society. Happy to tell anyone who wants to know who the cult is in a private message. Some people are confused by the timeline here, especially as to how my parents could have had children. Basically, once they had found each other and got married, they tried for children naturally but had trouble conceiving due to their ages. They eventually gave up and adopted as kids instead. Happy days. And NBSP. Yo guys. Thanks so much for all your kind words and interest. It means a lot to me that people really care about this kind of shit. It's usually so well hidden in society. It's 4 AM here and I've got a crash, but we'll pick up all your PMs and comments with the answers you seek tomorrow. Keep sending them and I'll get to them all when I can. Thank you all. Hey all. I've returned to Reddit this morning to find that my inbox has basically been completely obliterated. I think I've basically answered them all now. I hope. Thanks again for your interest. I realized my family was in a cult when I was 10 and we had a burn party for the television. As it exploded, people chanted, "Die. Satan. Die." Double quote. On mobile, so I'm sure I'm way late to the game, but here's my story. I literally walked into the Church of Scientology. I moved to Clearwater as a minor. Made some friends and walked into, without anyone present with me, into what I thought was a museum. Being brought up without any religion, although both my parents were raised conservative Muslims, I grabbed onto the ideology of you are what you make of yourself. Long story short, 5 years later, while working for a Scientology-owned company while still exploring whether I wanted to join or not, I got held hostage, literally, for 3 hours because I wouldn't accept their philosophy on a small incident and left the workforce only to have a beer bottle broken over my head by my LTO lifelong Scientologist boyfriend and have the cops, who were Scientologists, arrive at the house to determine there was nothing to escalate to a domestic violence report, and then later on, 2 days later, flee the house with my dogs and what little I could with the time I had for my own safety. So yeah, that's my life in the cult. Some people are cool. Most people are brainwashed. TLDRFCK Scientology. I've covered this when I first got on Reddit, but my parents joined a cult in West Texas when I was about 8-9 after searching for the truth their whole adult lives. Long story short, it wasn't that crazy at first. I like to use the frog in boiling water analogy. If it was that batshit insane when they first started going, they wouldn't have stayed. It became a doomsday cult. Multiple marriage. All the girls were married up by old elders, leaving nothing for us young dudes, so naturally, we rebelled. My escape wasn't as harrowing as some others, but my leaving did set up me saving my 15-year-old sister, under cover of darkness, abducting her from my dad's house and transporting her to my mom in LA, from marrying an elder who already had 4 wives and about 10 kids, who was later arrested for molesting his stepdaughter. It's been a wild ride, guys. This is my friend's story. He joined because he was homeless and they promised to get him clean and sober. He left because he got clean and sober. He took what he needed and faked the rest. There were others there out of desperation. He connected with a few of them. Their philosophy was eat the meat and spit out the bones. I'm still clean and sober. I had 3 years in January. I was raised a Jehovah's Witness. So I was brainwashed from infancy that this was the true religion. If you want an idea of what the cult was like, think of 1984. No. Seriously. That's not an exaggeration. The cult had no crimes, doublespeak, and a worshipful attitude of the governing body, head honchos of the cult, and anything they said was automatically right unless it was thought to be wrong later on by the same governing body. Any disagreement meant re-education and the ministry of love, or shunning, which meant complete avoidance by everyone still in the cult from you, including family members who were still in. I got out when I said enough is enough. I still haven't talked to my mother in 10 years. I had a friend who was born a Moonie. His mother and sister were still Moonies. But his father wasn't much of a believer anymore. Both he and his father just pretend to be Moonies for the sake of their mother, wife and sibling daughter. Wish he was a Redditor so he could come in here and share his story. Well, it was more of a small group with cultist traits than an actual cult. But the same principles apply. I got in as it was just forming. Back then it was just a place for like-minded people to discuss world affairs. I was an arrogant teenager who was more smart than wise, so I liked that part. Then it started to get progressively more isolated. The idea started to grow that people who didn't think the same things were by definition wrong and we shouldn't talk to them. Initially, I protested, but that was quickly smothered. I won't pretend I'm only a victim here. I made my choices and they were stupid. But it is hard to understand the effect of that isolation if you've never experienced it yourself. It can be similar to an emotionally abusive relationship where your partner gets progressively more controlling and possessive, and when you look back, you think, how could I possibly have let this all happen? Double quote. Then they wanted everyone to change themselves, to develop themselves and get rid of irrational thought behavior patterns. I bought into this at first, thinking I was growing to be a better person, a more positive influence on the world. Again, isolation and a good dose of the young arrogance of a clever but not intelligent person. I like to think I've grown a bit in that respect since the end of my cult life. Then I started to feel like I was losing myself, losing the idea of who I was. This was of course written off as being an irrational thought I needed to get rid of. I started to resist the constant changing more and more. They tried quarantining me with my then boyfriend, who was also part of the whole thing, because I was starting to rub off my rebellion on my best friend, who got caught up later when she was in a very vulnerable place in her life. That was probably the darkest period I've ever lived through, and I'm glad that I did live through it. At some point, the only reason I wanted to stay alive was because I couldn't bring that heartbreak upon my mother, who I was hardly allowed to see, her being a non-believer. Of course, because I knew she wouldn't understand, would never get closure, and I just couldn't do that to her. I had bad panic attacks. I had recurring nightmares where I was trying to run away from someone, but it felt like I was running through thick syrup. I held myself catatonic whenever my then boyfriend was trying to make me change again. I didn't know what to do, because I'd internalized their moral standards. Leaving their group seemed like the worst thing in the world to me, but I also couldn't keep doing what they told me to do. I was so stuck and lost. Eventually, they figured out I wasn't going to be a productive group member anymore, so they kicked me out. Came home from my shitty customer service student job one day. My boyfriend sat me down and broke up with me. I cried my eyes out. He left to go stay with friends. Next morning, I woke up, and I felt so f***ing free. Life felt so much brighter and better and more enjoyable. I finally didn't have to live up to their standards anymore. I loved it. Later, when the emotional aftermath started hitting me, I realized I'd still internalized their moral standards. I'd just accepted that I was a bad person. It's been 2 years now since I got kicked out. I'm still dealing with it often, but getting better. I'm learning to look at it as a valuable lesson now. But I'm not kidding myself. It was horrible. It was shit. It scarred me in a way that'll never be gone. I'm just going to have to turn those scars into a strength. Edit. Because I know we all love a happy ending. By the way, about a year and change after I got kicked out, I saw my best friend was no longer Facebook friends with the cult people. I'd been wanting to contact her for a long time, but I was chicken and I didn't want to deal with the possible heartbreak of her telling me I was evil and that she didn't want anything to do with me. So when I saw she was probably not in contact with those people anymore, I was so f***ing happy. I sent her a message. We met up, bonded over our experiences, and it was just like old times. Turns out she had been kicked out in a similar fashion as I had been just a few months after me, and was also kinda afraid to contact me. I'm still so f***ing happy to have my friend back. During my paranoid druggy years I got pretty into Alex Jones and InfoWars. closest thing I ever got to a cult. Looking back, I see a 19-year-old moron. And for some reason I really wanted all that conspiracy shit to be true. And I'm not sure exactly why that was. Almost as if, were that stuff all true? And there was a grand conspiracy, on some weird level it would make up for the gaps in my life. Edit. Thinking back on that time, I remember writing this dramatic memo warning to the nation. Based on the Alex Jones stuff. I hadn't looked at it for years until about 5 minutes ago. It's actually oddly relevant now. Probably through sheer coincidence. Check it out. Comma. I've been involved in a number of cults both as a leader and a follower. You have more fun as a follower but you make more money as a leader. I inherited a Subaru and it broke down 5 years later. Creed Bratton always has the answers. I bought my first Apple product back in 1998 and since I've constantly replaced each product with a newer upgrade. I feel I have lost all privacy, freedom and sense of identity, and yet I continue to pay my hard-earned towards this organization. I am yet to escape and currently have 4 different iPhones and 2 MacBook Pros. Joined the 12 tribes of Israel back in 2012. I met them through one of their cafes in Colorado. The idea of communal living and dedication to a cause was very appealing to someone who hadn't had a job in a while and was going to lose their home soon. The mask of super friendliness and hospitality was covering up racism, child abuse, and total domination of people's lives. I mean total. From what time you woke up, to how you dress, to how to wipe your ass. Spent 3 years of my life there, working 12 to 16 hours days 6 days a week. I was being groomed to get married and become a leader in the community when I left with just some clothes. The controlling nature of the place made it feel like a prison camp and I couldn't take it anymore. A year and a half later and I'm the happiest I've ever been. I'm waiting for someone to mention their landmark forum experience. When I was studying at a university in Japan, a professor's wife decided to become friends with a number of students, including me. She soon began to talk about her Buddhist religion and invited me to a prayer session. I agreed to go, though at the time was unaware that it was really a Soka Gakkai cult get-together. Over the next few months, I was reluctantly dragged to several of these meetings. Most of them involved the religious community getting together in a large hall to watch video recordings of their precious Daisaku Ikeda painting pictures or speaking, to which the attendees always reacted in admiration. It was almost like what you see in documentaries about North Korea, just complete adoration of an infallible leader. The woman was so nice and blindly devoted to her religion that I didn't want to hurt her feelings. But I eventually sent her a long email explaining that I wasn't interested in joining the religion. That it clashed with my own Christian beliefs, though in reality I am not religious, and asked her politely to never take me to another Soka Gakkai event again. She apologized and said that she was never trying to get me to join the religion. And she promised not to take me to another event. We agreed to meet again for lunch sometime soon to make up. That lunch turned out to be another large Soka Gakkai event. It was like she was completely blind to what she was doing. I gave up and just cut ties with her after that. I was born into the Jehovah's Witness cult. I was a true believer for 34 years. Then one day, I decided to do some deep research into the doctrines of the cult. I woke up from the cult within 2 months. Not me, but my friend's dad was in Scientology. She would talk all the time about her dad, who was a very successful plumber, basically building his plumbing business from the ground up and then expanding across multiple states. He would receive special training but only after he cut a new check that could otherwise buy a luxury car. It got so bad that he siphoned money off from the company, and it collapsed. After that, Scientology wanted nothing to do with him. It's a cult of money. They only want your damn money. My friend and her dad survived, but it took him a long time to accept defeat about what happened. I don't know if people count it, but I definitely feel like the Landmark Forum is a cult of sorts. My dad used to be part of it when I was in high school and it weirded me out because he would act and talk differently and give me brother and I lectures on happiness. He finally dragged us to a meeting and it was unsettling. There was this air of forced positivity. They made jokes about accusations about them being a cult. And when they took us to a separate lesson in was some illogical BS meant to inspire us. It was telling that my church youth leader was there. He's insanely stringent and kind of strange. Anyway, my dad didn't listen when we asked him to stop going. But he finally backed out when they kept calling him incessantly and when they wanted him to pay large sums of money to advance in the program. I was 18. I just wanted to start a new life and they seemed so inviting. I told my mom I was going to school in the States. She didn't ask many questions. My dad had just passed and I told her they offered me a scholarship. I left in January. I was greeted by many foreigners who had just graduated high school. I think in total there was 55 of us. They didn't have a place for us to live when we first got there. We ended up living in an abandoned hospital. I was scared. But everyone else around me acted like it was normal. The second day they took our passports to scan them in case we lost them. That was the last time I saw my passport for 3 months. When I questioned them about it, they said the scanner needed repairs but it was high on their priorities. The second week was a struggle. One of the leaders called me out amongst the entire group and said I had been infected with evil and was demon sent. This led to me being cast away from the group. I tried to find friends and the locals but instead found cocaine for my first time. Went on a good 2-week binge spending nearly $800. Eventually, they invited me back. They held me on the ground and had an exorcism to remove the evil. I was so scared. I was so high. I played along. This went on for almost 10 months on and off being attacked. I got my passport and fled back to Canada, my home country, with one of the girls who was also enrolled. It's too long of a story to tell the entire 10 months. I ended up going back recently to the city to shoot a photo series that I'm currently developing in the darkroom to turn into a book. If anyone interested in more let me know. It'll continue in the morning. Edit. Spelling and such. This account was made specifically to hide myself from family, friends and others who are still a part of the cult I left. Jehovah's Witnesses are a cult that I was born into. And I still have not fully left it. I am merely ceasing all activities with them and refusing to answer any official communications with their leadership, elders. My parents were both raised Southern Baptist Pentecostal. They went to this particular church on and off as teenagers because their parents encouraged them to. They met in the church and started dating. It was that time they started to notice weirdness with the higher ups. They were trying to make my parents break up constantly. 50-plus-year-old men. They believed women couldn't teach the word of God, trying to snuff out two 17-year-olds' relationship. They started spreading rumors that my mom was pregnant and that they were fornicating, which wasn't the case at all. It was so bad that my parents rushed to elope as soon as they were both 18 to shut everyone up. My siblings and I were a part of the church until my parents moved to another state. I was 6-7 but when I was 13 we moved back to that area and my parents started going to that church again. It was a negative, judgmental environment. I was being bullied in Sunday school because I wasn't raised in the church. I witnessed a woman that looked like she had a hard life. Tattoos. Heroin chick. Wearing the best clothes she could find looking for God only to get harassed out the door by some teenage girls. In the church women can't cut their hair, wear makeup, wear jewelry, wear sleeves past 3/4 length, wear pants. Men can't have facial hair, have to have short hair, can't have tattoos, wear jewelry. Both genders can't watch TV or listen to secular music and it's forbidden to dance. All the doctrine was about how the world is ending and that everyone is going to hell. It was like the crucible in that place. I refused to go and would get yelled at by my parents a lot for not wanting to. Eventually my siblings fought back too. Then one day an old lady from the church grabbed my arm and was trying to exorcise demons from me, going on about me being possessed and a sinner. That was the last day my family went to that church. My dad grabbed my arm and pulled me from those people and we walked out the door. I believe in God, but I don't believe in church. The only time Jesus got mad is when he went to a temple. Matthew 21. 12-13. Someone else mentioned having a friend who was a Moonie. I too grew up in the Unification Church and left when I was about 18. My parents joined back in the 70s when the movement was at its peak and were blessed, married, to one another by the church leader. Some young moon after some time witnessing and such. The church is best known for mass weddings where most couples had never met one another. It's odd. The environment of the church never felt much like a cult beyond the thought process that the church founder was the second coming. That and arranged marriages. Beyond that, the community was very caring and pretty progressive. I've met devout Christians who are more radical than most of the unificationists I've known. My family still practice, but now that some young moon has passed, I think the church itself is losing steam and breaking off into different groups. I left because of the fact blessed children AKBCs, children born into the church, are expected to marry within the church. Never seemed right to me to treat all humans as equal in the eyes of God. But not mixed theologically. My parents were pretty intense the first few years of my falling out. Especially regarding me dating. But they've begun to come around. I think the church instilled a lot of good qualities in me. And I think the term cult can be pretty demonizing. That being said, there are many things I'd prefer my children be other than religious. Was born into the Jehovah's Witness cult. I had no choice. I was forced in. I woke up at 12 and I'm 15 currently planning my escape. I'm going to go to college in a galaxy far away and I'm never looking back. This cult sucks. I myself have never been in a cult. However, before the Reverend Jim Jones moved the People's Temple to California, he lived in Indiana right next door to my father. I believe it was on Broadway Street. My father was friends with Jim's adopted son and they played together on a regular basis. My father's mother, my grandmother, was close to Jim's wife and still to this day will defend her, saying she was a good woman and Jim Jones had her manipulated. They said Jim was an odd guy. Nice, but weird. He sold monkeys, yes monkeys, to make money. He invited my family to their church on several occasions, including when they moved to California. They declined. Years later, my father and grandmother watched on the news that Jim Jones was responsible for the deaths of over 900 people. Makes you think, what if, you know? My family was raised in a cult called ATI. Same thing the Duggars were taught. My mom knew of them and attended a few events and met them before they were famous. Parents realized it was absolutely insane and jumped ship. Now we all laugh about it and look at pictures of us back then in horror and amusement. Puppies. Almost got inducted into Amway in the early 1990s. Fortunately, I was an independent-minded, non-Christian, non-materialistic woman, therefore of little use to them. I escaped with only a loss of the $200 I spent on training materials. Born into it, so never knew any different. Tried to escape at 16. Ended up homeless. Alone. Frightened. Hungry. Depressed. Was heavily drugged by my mother and sucked back into the cult at 19. Escaped for good at 28 and lost all family, friends, community, social network, employment, etc. They said I was dead to them if I left, and 20 years later they still treat me the same way. It's affected my whole life. They are the Watchtower, Bible and Tract Society, WTBTS. You probably know them as Jehovah's Witnesses. Does narrowly avoiding being raised in a cult count? Anyway, this will never get seen, but it's something I think about a lot, so here goes. My parents are very conservative Christians and went to a lot of seminars purporting to teach godly parenting and family values when I was a kid. These were big seminars. Whole families would go. So I went too, and while my parents were at the adult part, I went to the children's seminar where we learned about obeying our parents if we wanted God to take care of us and other stuff like that. Very religious but nothing too crazy. The guy who came up with this program was a big deal in homeschooling conservative fundamentalist Christian circles in the 90s, and he made bank off of teaching the exact specific rules your family had to follow in order to keep God's protection over your family and avoid your children becoming drug dealers and prostitutes, etc. He had, and still has, never been married or had a family himself. But you know, God showed him all these rules and they work perfectly, but only if you follow them exactly, and to find out how to do that you had to pay him money for his materials and pay to come to these seminars. So my parents went to a couple of these. I remember at least 2. And we used some of his materials in our homeschool curriculum. But my parents are just conservative and Christian, not straight up insane. So they only went to a couple of the seminars, accepted the more normal teachings, and never got in much farther than that. My friend was not so lucky. My friend's family was really into this program. After a while my friend's sisters stopped being allowed to wear pants because that was a sin against God, and if girls wore pants God could remove his protection from the family and something horrible might happen to them all. Married women had to ask their husbands permission for everything. I mean stuff like, what should I make for dinner tonight? Doing anything to prevent a pregnancy, even I'm kinda tired honey maybe let's not have sex tonight, was also a sin against God and meant you didn't trust him to plan your life. Then just petty weird stuff like all the children in the family were supposed to wear matching outfits, usually some variation of khaki pants, long skirts and navy blue dark colored polo shirts. Eventually this family got invited to live in the main headquarters, a giant building in the state capital that functioned as a compound, and I didn't really hear from them anymore. A couple of years ago shit hit the fan when this creepy old dude who had never been married, never had a family, and who had extremely specific rules about how women were allowed to look, long curly hair, long skirts, wear navy blue, surprise surprise, was accused of rape, sexual assault, and sexual harassment by more than 30 women, some very young teenagers, who had worked for him at the compound over a period of 2 decades. When I told my parents they were shocked. They genuinely had no idea. Some cults are obviously batshit crazy to any normal outside observer. But some are only really nuts if you invest enough time and money. By the time you're far enough in to think, hey wait a second, you've already started to think enough like the rest of the cult that you just get pulled farther in. My parents just took the relatively normal stuff and that was enough for them. My friend's parents got in just a little bit deeper and they spiraled. I reconnected with my friend over the internet a few years ago after he'd left the cult. It pretty much destroyed his family and his sense of self, and he's had to start from the ground up to rebuild himself as a person. I feel incredibly lucky that my parents were okay with the surface level teachings and felt like that was enough for them. I can't imagine my life if they decided to just go to a few more seminars. I was born and raised in a group called the 2x2s on the internet. The Truth Meeting. All the friends by the people in it. Ultra conservative Christians. Long jean skirts. Long hair. No church building. Yearly gatherings in the high hundreds called conventions. They go to church, which they call meetings 3 times a week. Bible study on Wednesdays. Twice on Sundays. Preachers are called workers and go in same-sex pairs. And don't have a home or a family. And are supposed to remain celibate. They stay in the homes of the friends. Double quote. This shit is the most emotionally and physically demanding thing. It's a grand old time if you're a straight dude. But if you're a woman who wants anything beside keeping your knees shut, your long hair in a bun, no makeup, no sleeveless shirts, you know how seductive those shoulders are. Or to marry a patriarchal mothurfka who expects you to obey him like back in the old school marriage vows. Then you're not welcome. Also, they think their church has existed non-stop since Jesus and the apostle thing 2000 years ago. But it actually started in the 1900s by some dude from the UK who later went bonkers. There have been several instances in which they actively covered up sexual abuse by friends and by workers. There are a surprising number of people who are in this shit. Like probably in the tens of thousands across the country and around the world. But they don't make records of their numbers known. They claim to not take money. But Jesus knows their operation takes a lot of Benjamins to fund. I left. And luckily my family still loves and speaks to me even though I've become a raging liberal atheist who's now happily married to an outsider. They don't have the whole charismatic leader thing that most cults have. And I'm not even sure it's a cult by the traditional definition of the word. but I've heard the term high demand religion thrown around and that sounds about right to me. My parents are Christian socialists. They hold very strict beliefs about marketing, consumerism, and material goods. Anything that is not a necessity for life is considered excessive. You should not value money over your fellow people. So it was pretty much mandatory to keep new purchases to a minimum since it would be bad to benefit a company that treated their workers poorly. Thrifting is okay because you're not directly giving money to bad companies. Basically everything I owned as a child was used. I was not allowed mass market toys because the marketing for them manipulated children. I generally was not able to buy new clothes because spending money directly on your appearance in that way is vain. My parents also gave about half of their income to charity because the expectation is that you take what you need to live, and then to prevent yourself from being tempted to consume, you get rid of the rest of your money. Basically by the time I was 16 I was a couple of philosophical differences away from being a Buddhist nun. That's how strict the material detachment was. Jehovah's Witnesses. Born into it in 1992. Escaped 4 years ago to the chagrin of my parents. The information age and access to material outside their prescription literature were among the many elements which helped me escape. My mom was a wild child also born into it. Left to party. Came crawling back upon learning she was pregnant and ended up forcing my dad to join eventually. They raised 4 boys into a small, hateful community and we've all managed to break the chains independently. I've never felt more liberated in all my life. I was born into the Jehovah's Witnesses. If you're thinking are they really a cult? They seem nice. Yes. They do seem nice. And yes. They really are a cult. They just wear boring 1950s business attire instead of cool ass robes. I woke up a few years ago. There's no simple answer for how it happened. Over the course of years my mind slowly began to resist the indoctrination. I didn't think worldly people, that's all you nice non-JW folks, were deserving of death for the sin of not being JWs. I didn't think homosexuality was an abomination. This took me a long time to come around on. Reddit helped a lot by forcing me to read the personal stories of people in the homosexual community and how they're treated. I didn't think that shunning someone for the rest of their life, theirs, not mine. We're living forever. Because they slept with their so. Or accepted a blood transfusion. Or celebrated Christmas. Or talked to someone else who has been disfellowshipped, excommunicated. Or any one of a million other things was moral or ethical in any capacity. Also, the Bible is kinda super gross with lots of godly commission baby slaughter. All of this and a bunch of other things slowly broke me down and forced me to leave. I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown and couldn't handle it anymore. As a result most of my family and former friends are shunning me. Ironically. That made the decision easier. I finally get to tell this story. I was involved in a cult in college. I was a relatively normal dude. Studying at unsex school. Fraternity member. Etc. It seemed normal at first. I was dating a girl in it at the time. Then it started getting more and more restrictive. And as I rose up in seniority I became ostracized because I had the audacity to ask the why questions. I was separated from my friends and family. And brainwashed in a weird, f***ed up way that has still effectively destroyed my previously strong faith. The best way I can explain it when I left is that I just realized one day that the whole place seemed really f***ing weird. They build a huge ass building that they live in. And threaten you with damnation if you don't go to work for them or give them money. Great Commission Ministries, now known as Reliant Ministries, affiliated group in College Station called Fellowship Church. FCK them. I was born into Jehovah's Witnesses. A lot of the doctrines made me wonder as a small child, but when you're forced into it by a parent that fully believes, it's hard to say no. Being told at age 6 to enjoy my time with my unbelieving parent because they would die at Armageddon and not be in paradise was brutal. My choices in music and entertainment were never good enough. And I had no friends my age. I was constantly told that the end of the world was just around the corner. So don't worry about going to college or setting yourself up for the future. There were no holidays or birthdays to celebrate. The only thing I really had to look forward to was getting a nice new dress for the memorial every year. What really kick-started me on my way out was having the Bible thrown at me when I left door knocking early one day to go see relatives that were not in the church. The elders berated me so heavily that I was reduced to tears. I was told that they didn't matter and I shouldn't be associating with them, but I should stay out and bother people on a Saturday afternoon. The fact that I had put in 35 hours already that week didn't matter. Nor that I was active in commenting at meetings and having parts on the school that were phenomenal, by their standards. I looked into their doctrines after that and did outside research, which is a serious offense. I started planning my getaway and faded over the next several months. The last 2 months before I moved hours away. The elders kept calling me for my service time. I told them I had 0 hours and they were disturbed. One elder decided to falsify my time card and give me a few hours for each month because I had previously been such a good witness. He was sure I had informally witnessed to someone. I moved away and haven't set foot in a Kingdom hall since. The few friends I had cut all contact with me. I still have one parent in the religion though, so I'm on eggshells constantly to avoid losing contact with them. Even though that should have happened years ago by their standards. I've had the threat of cutting contact dangled over my head many times. I still get invited to come back by elders that drop by when I'm visiting my parents. Nice. One I can actually answer. My family used to be Christian, really normal Christians too. Nothing crazy. Just midline. However, we then started reading the Old Testament and were blown away by all the things we didn't know about the history of not only the Jewish people but of Christianity and how it came to be. This led us down a path of discovery. Which, at first, was actually really cool. We, as a family, learned a lot of history and even got a grasp of some of the Hebrew language. There were a lot of others coming into this knowledge of the Old Testament around that time. And we even convinced some of our fellow Christians to leave the church with us and Christianity and to follow this new understanding, which included the Old Testament and with that of the teachings of Jesus. It was harmless enough. We were basically Messianic Jews. However, soon we began listening to revered teachers within the movement and ended up buying supplies to flee to the mountains and live where no one could find us. At the time it didn't seem crazy. We thought the world was ending after all. That is what the teachers said. Too. So it must have been right. Keep in mind my dad has a PhD and my mom also has a minor in psychology. We weren't dumb people. It just seemed to snowball. Especially with all the events in the world. And panic in the media. Our brains just latched onto something we could do to protect ourselves. We didn't realize what we were in was a cult until we moved across the state to join a group of like-minded believers. Still. It took us several years before we completely realized. The movement has now become known as the Hebrew Roots Movement. Or Torah Observant Movement. Lots of good-intentioned people who honestly are trying to understand more about their belief. Usually they are all originally Christians. Are led astray by teachers. Next thing we knew, we ate a lamb at Passover that someone has literally just sacrificed in their backyard. Yeah. My parents became upset at the family for doing such a thing. Sacrificing it, and we left. A year or so later we realized how diluted we had become and how much of an illusion we lived in. And we left. We left our friends' family and they no longer speak to us. Now we are Christians again, but we don't really go to church ever. We are now considered evil people. By those in the movement. That are no longer to be associated with. Luckily we moved to another state and started anew. Overall. It was a slow descent into a belief that, at the time, made sense. It was a slow enough progression into falsehood that the false things being taught could be covered over with a lot of truth about the Jewish culture, history of the Bible, etc. Until the next thing you know you are trying to be a Levite in 2017. Was raised as an independent fundamental Baptist my whole life in Texas and Oklahoma. I met a guy on Imgur that unintentionally challenged my beliefs. Long story short. I said FCK being oppressed inside of my own religion at 21. Moved out. Couch surfed. Started dating Imgur guy and eventually moved across the country for him at 22. I'm 24. and still with him. Anyone heard of Equipping Christian Center? Grew up there. No childhood. Homeschooled and locked in a room for around 18-22 hours a day. Services lasted from 9 AM Sunday and went all day to sometimes 4 to 5 AM Monday. Cold showers. Whipping with fiberglass rods that cut skin. Public ridicule and berating for small infractions. Forcing of members to belittle and verbally abuse the naughty, and on and on and on. Escaped by joining the Air Force and lost everything I had ever known besides my mom, dad, stepmom, 5 nieces and nephews, 2 stepsisters and 3 brothers all cut me off. It's been 6 years and I still don't know who I am or how to associate with people. Got sent to a Christian boarding school when I was 14. Mum drops me off and after she leaves I learn the rules. Turns out they were Pentecostal, erring on the side of delusion. Women were supposed to submit to men. A calf muscle showing was the worst thing imaginable. Secular music was of the devil. The pastor was this 80-year-old man who would make you stand up and he would pray over you and speak in tongues until you fell out from the Holy Spirit. When I refused to fall out, I was told I was possessed and required remedial classes. I totally fell into it and started believing all the garbage after about 6 months. A couple years in, a few of the students went on a spring break trip with a mission trip to Appalachian, Kentucky. There was a pastor of a church who used to work at the boarding school location who we were helping out. Everything was hunky-dory till the pastor decided I had a fear demon or some shit like that attached to me. He called me up in front of the congregation and brought out a box and made me put my hand in through the cracked lid. I distinctly remember not feeling anything in there. He then opened a lid and there was a very poisonous snake inside. Copperhead? Can't remember exactly. Needless to say I lost my shit and kept my head down for another 6 months till I was able to leave. Not sure if that is considered a cult. But I was definitely brainwashed. I dated a girl whose parents were part of the Branch Davidians. The Waco siege thing. Apparently they left shortly before the siege happened. Maybe. I don't know. The dad wasn't too crazy but the mom was. I wouldn't be surprised if they were at the siege. I was born into a cult that my parents had joined years earlier. We got out when I was 12. Just before they could start sticking their hooks in me. It just took a eureka moment on my dad's part when it clicked that something was wrong with the way they were worshipping. The cult was all about bullying tactics. If a member couldn't meet their yearly tithing requirement, they were guilted into asking another member to put up what you couldn't. Members had garage sales to raise money for the church and were told to purposefully sell items that had sentimental value because it would mean more to God. A specific story from my parents involved the church sitting all of their friends in a room and having them glare at my parents to shame them. I didn't ask what the cause was for this, but my guess is it was money related. In the end, a whole bunch of members realized what was going on at the same time and there was a sort of mass exodus. My parents are still believers, but my dad hasn't visited an organized religious establishment since. He still kicks himself for all the wasted time and for all the extra years he's going to have to work before retirement to make up for the money he gave. I was born into the fringes of an Eastern-based cult. Raised loosely but then joined a small offshoot at 18. I was drawn to it because I had already been infected. As I see it, with the idea that regular life was fleeting and meaningless and the only purpose derived from transcending desires. I became he leader's personal assistant. Lived as a monk for almost 7 years. And was in the upper management of the group. I was manipulated out of lots of money and lived day in and day out in an environment of psychological abuse, overworking, and general anxiety. But I thought I was happy. Which is one of the insidious things about cultic abuse. Among other things, Reddit actually helped me escape. I began meeting women online in my intense loneliness. And that became a place where I got some genuine, well-meaning affection that wasn't bound by the ideology. One friend I made gave me the courage to leave the monastery. I was still a dedicated member of the organization for a year before my whole life collapsed and I realized how much it had really f***ed with my head. I was fortunate to quickly find knowledgeable support and meet other ex-members. But leaving is hell. I spent 9 months barely able to function and I still deal daily with baggage from it all. Now I try to write and work in various ways to assist with education and recovery about cults. And plan to do so as part of my future profession. Edit. Not sure why I didn't just say this was all the Hare Krishnas. People ought to know there is far more to them than their public image, and I recommend googling most groups you're interested in. Self-help groups, MLMs, intense exercise groups, etc. All have been known to be fertile for cultic abuse. I'm muscular but overweight. So when someone said, hey, there's this gym we can go to where none of the workouts are ever the same and there's lots of lifting but it's reps mostly not weight so you won't just get bulkier, just slim up with what you've got, I was kind of sold. Next thing I know I've bought new shoes and clothes all with this place's name on them and I'm doing all these off the wall diets that literally make absolutely no sense. When I'm out and about the only people that talk to me are people from this gym and the only thing they talk about is this gym and it's like if you're not at the gym at that particular moment then you're talking about the next time you will be at the gym. And God forbid you miss even a single day. You may as well have just burned down a church. Don't get me started on if you're not buying the proper pre and post workout drinks and bars. I don't give a shit what you say. CrossFit is a f-king cult and I'm glad to be out of it.